When a child goes silent, the world should listen, but sometimes silence is easier to ignore. In a quiet Ohio town, a girl named Emily Carter disappeared long before anyone noticed she was missing. Not physically, she still came to class, sat in her usual seat, and turned in her homework. But the girl who once laughed loudest at recess had vanished behind a mask of quiet obedience. Her third-grade teacher, Miss Tran, saw it first. Emily no longer drew colorful cats and daydream castles. Instead, she stared out the window, eyes unfocused as if waiting for something no one else could see. She spoke only when spoken to. Her joy, her spark, her voice gone. And when bruises began appearing beneath long sleeves, everyone accepted the same explanation: she was clumsy. But what no one saw coming was how those silent years would one day scream from the pages of a sketchbook, and how that silence would become the key to uncovering a truth buried for over a decade. It began quietly, almost forgettably. One missed homework assignment. One odd moment when Emily flinched after a classmate laughed too loudly. Miss Tran noticed her fading smile, but the real concern started during a spelling test. Emily's arm brushed the desk, and her sleeve slipped back. A yellowish bruise marked her elbow, faint healing, but not small. When Miss Tran asked about it after class, Emily looked up and gave the kind of answer children learn too early. She said she had fallen while playing in the backyard. The story matched the one from last month when a bruise had appeared on her shin. But now something was different. The way Emily said it didn't sound like a child brushing off an accident. It sounded like a rehearsed line. At the first parent-teacher conference, Gary Benson showed up alone. He was Emily's stepfather, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and overly confident. He took the seat across from Miss Tran with the ease of someone used to being in control. She had prepared notes on Emily's behavior, her social withdrawal, the bruises, the missed assignments, but Gary never let her finish a sentence. He had an answer for everything. Emily had been having nightmares. Her dog had died. Kids went through things. Rachel, Emily's mother, couldn't make it. She worked nights. Miss Tran tried to press gently, but Gary's eyes hardened. He wasn't rude, but there was an undercurrent in his tone that made her instinctively stop pushing. He left with a handshake that lingered a beat too long, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He didn't ask to see Emily's schoolwork or artwork. He didn't even look at her file. The weeks that followed were colder. Winter crept in early that year, and Emily seemed to shrink inside her oversized jackets. At lunch, she no longer sat with friends. She ate quickly and quietly, always glancing toward the clock. During recess, she stood near the oak tree by the fence, her boots barely moving. One afternoon during indoor reading time, Miss Tran saw Emily sketching something on the back of a math worksheet. It was a staircase, narrow and steep, leading down into a shaded square. At the bottom was a small door with no handle. Miss Tran leaned in and asked about it. Emily didn't look up. She whispered it was just a dream she kept having. Then she erased the drawing. In early December, Emily came in late, wearing just a t-shirt under her coat, despite the frigid temperature. When she reached up to hang her jacket, Miss Tran saw a dark bruise on her upper arm. Not a scrape. Not something that happened while playing. That afternoon, she made the call. She didn't tell the principal. She didn't ask permission. She contacted CPS directly and filed a report. Bruises. Withdrawing. Inconsistent stories. Unexplained drawing. A gut feeling. That's all she had, but she hoped it would be enough. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, Emily stopped coming to school. A withdrawal notice arrived. Rachel Carter was homeschooling her now. The form was typed no signature. The school was instructed not to contact the family further. No explanation. No visit. Just gone. Miss Tran stared at the letter in disbelief. She opened Emily's desk to gather her belongings and found a folder of drawings. One was torn and faded. A girl sat curled at the bottom of stairs, hands over her ears. Miss Tran held it for a long moment before placing it in her drawer. Years later, that same drawing would appear in the news. But back then, no one believed a sketch could be a cry for help. No one realized a door without a handle meant a girl with no way out. Miss Tran sat at her desk one cold Thursday evening with the classroom empty and the fluorescent lights buzzing quietly overhead. She could not shake the memory of Emily's last day. It had been too quiet, too ordinary. There had been no tearful goodbye, or even a hint that she might never see her again. Just a girl with a sweater pulled over her hands, staring at the window as snow fell. After the withdrawal notice, Miss Tran kept scanning news reports and CPS updates, hoping for a follow-up, a case reopened anything. But nothing came. When she drove through the neighborhood near Emily's house, the windows of the small, white home on the corner were always shuttered. No laughter from the backyard anymore. No pink bicycle in the driveway. Then, a neighbor's voicemail reached the school office. The voice belonged to Mrs. Lindell, a woman in her 60s who lived across the street. She had seen Emily once in the yard wearing short sleeves in early November, her arms covered in old bruises. She had called CPS, but the case had been closed within a week. Miss Tran sat back, feeling her stomach turn. Gary had once worked as a deputy. The following week, Miss Tran reached out to the school's administrative office and gently brought up the idea of checking in with the family one more time. She was told the withdrawal was legal and processed properly. Without any new evidence, they could not intervene. Still, she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. She gathered her notes and printed a copy of the photo she had taken of the bruise. She wrote a letter and dropped it anonymously at the local police department. But nothing came of it. No visit, no questions. Emily was simply gone. 2 months passed. Then, just after New Year's, Rachel Carter showed up at the school unexpectedly. Her eyes were tired, her hair tied back loosely. She said she was returning Emily's textbooks and wanted to thank the school for everything. Her words sounded scripted, practiced. When Miss Tran happened to pass her in the hall, she asked if Emily was adjusting to homeschooling. Rachel nodded quickly and said everything was fine. But her eyes did not meet Miss Tran's. And when asked if Emily missed her classmates, Rachel said she had grown shy and preferred to be alone. Days later, Emily's desk was cleared out by a janitor. Miss Tran found a single crayon under the drawer, its tip worn down to nothing. She picked it up and held it for a long time before dropping it in the trash. The loss settled in heavy and immovable. No one else seemed to be fighting for her. A few of Emily's classmates asked where she had gone. Miss Tran kept her answers vague. She said Emily was being homeschooled now and that she was safe. She hoped it was true. That spring, while attending a district-wide training on child safety protocols, Miss Tran raised her hand during a Q&A session. She asked what could be done if someone believed a withdrawn student was in danger after being pulled from school. The speaker paused, then gave a polite but evasive answer. He said teachers were responsible while children were enrolled. Once they left, jurisdiction ended unless a formal investigation was underway. Miss Tran took a deep breath and said nothing. But that night she added a final note to her personal folder on Emily Carter. She labeled it No Resolution. Meanwhile, across town, the White House with the shutters stayed quiet. Rachel stopped attending church. The grocery clerk mentioned that she now shopped late at night, often alone. Gary, however, was seen often. He volunteered with a local neighborhood watch group and attended town hall meetings. He talked openly about safety and keeping children out of trouble. He joked about how tough teenagers could be these days. People laughed and nodded. Some still remembered when he wore a badge. No one asked about Emily. No one mentioned the girl with the sketchbook who had once filled the classroom with questions about the solar system. At some point, even the teachers stopped talking about it. There were new students, new problems, new families moving in. Life moved on. But inside a drawer in Miss Tran's desk, that torn drawing still remained. She could not throw it away. It was the only trace left. And somehow she believed it would matter one day. She just did not know when. Emily's absence began to fade from public memory, but one person never stopped trying to reach her. Her maternal grandmother, Judith Carter, had lived 3 towns over and had only seen Emily during holidays or occasional visits. After the withdrawal from school, Judith started calling Rachel more often. Most calls went unanswered. Once in a while, Rachel would respond with a short text saying they were busy or that Emily was doing fine. There were no photos attached. Judith found this odd. Rachel used to send pictures all the time, especially around birthdays. After nearly 8 months of silence, Judith got in her car one spring weekend and drove to their house without warning. The lawn looked untouched. A hose coiled tightly near the porch. The curtains were drawn. She knocked and waited. Rachel opened the door halfway. Her hair looked unwashed. Her voice was soft and apologetic. She said Emily was asleep and not feeling well. Judith offered to wait or return later. Rachel insisted it was a bad weekend. As the conversation grew more tense, Gary appeared behind Rachel, his eyes fixed on Judith. He said they had plans. Rachel closed the door quietly. Judith stood there a moment, then drove home. A month later, Judith received a letter in the mail. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a sheet of lined paper with a short typed message thanking her for the visit and apologizing for not being able to spend more time together. It was signed at the bottom with Emily's name. But Judith had kept every card and letter Emily had ever sent her since preschool. She took the new letter and compared the signature. The slant was wrong. The loops were uneven. Most of all, it lacked the small heart Emily used to draw over the I in her name. Judith knew this was not her granddaughter's handwriting. She brought the letter to her local sheriff's office. The deputy on duty listened, but said without proof of a crime, there was nothing they could do. Judith asked if they could at least conduct a wellness check. He made a note, but did not promise action. That night she sat in her kitchen, staring at the letter, feeling helpless. She knew something was off, but everyone else seemed ready to believe the lie. Meanwhile, life inside the house grew darker. Emily, now 9, was not allowed outside except for late-night drives to a nearby pharmacy or a small gas station. Gary took her on these short outings when no one would recognize her. She was instructed not to speak unless spoken to. If she made noise after bedtime, she was punished. She stopped asking for books. She drew only when no one was watching. Her sketchbook became a hidden world. She ripped out pages and tucked them behind the closet drywall. Each drawing told pieces of a truth she was too afraid to say. One was a door with no knob. Another showed a girl with tape over her mouth. The most detailed one showed a stairwell. At the bottom was a mattress on the floor. A single window showed only darkness. These sketches were not just dreams. They were memories of what she called the quiet room. It was where she had to stay when Gary said she was being difficult. In late 2011, Emily fell ill with severe stomach pain. Rachel drove her to a nearby emergency room under Gary's instruction. He stayed behind. Rachel gave a different last name at check-in. She sat silently in the corner as Emily underwent tests. When the physician on duty reviewed the scans, he noticed signs of multiple healed fractures. Some were consistent with accidents, others were not. He asked Rachel about past injuries. She gave vague answers. The doctor stepped out and quietly called the attending pediatric specialist. After reviewing the x-rays, the specialist asked to speak with Rachel in private. He raised the issue of suspected physical abuse. Rachel immediately became defensive. She said Emily was clumsy. She said she had fallen downstairs more than once. When asked if she would consent to a social worker visit, Rachel hesitated. Then she said she needed to call her husband. She took Emily by the hand and left before the paperwork could be finalized. By the time hospital staff contacted the local CPS office, Rachel and Emily were already gone. They had used a false address. The case was flagged, but eventually marked unresolved. No follow-up was made. Emily learned never to speak during doctor visits again. She learned that lies kept her safe in the moment, even if they made her feel hollow afterward. At home, she stopped keeping track of days. She remembered Judith's soft voice and how she used to braid her hair. Sometimes she would close her eyes and pretend her grandmother was in the room reading her a story. But those moments passed quickly. Rachel stopped reading. Gary started locking the sketchbooks away. One night, Emily found a crayon under the couch and drew a picture on the inside of the closet door. It showed a girl peeking out from behind a wall. Her eyes were wide, her mouth was open, but no sound came out. Beneath it, Emily wrote 3 words: "I am here." 2 years passed slowly. Emily, now 11, barely resembled the girl who once twirled in her grandmother's kitchen in sparkly socks. She had grown taller but thinner, her face pale and eyes distant. Rachel had stopped pretending everything was fine. She no longer dressed neatly or kept the house in order. Most days she said little at all. She followed Gary's instructions without question and avoided eye contact with Emily. There was a silence in the house that felt heavier than before. No music played. The curtains remained drawn. Meals were eaten in quiet. Rachel barely acknowledged her daughter except when Gary demanded it. Emily learned to be invisible. She moved quietly and never cried. She kept her drawings hidden under the loose floorboard behind her bed. The pictures had become more detailed. One page showed a girl holding a flashlight in a hallway with no end. Another showed a woman with hollow eyes sitting beside a locked door. Each line carried truth no one else wanted to see. In the quiet hours before Gary returned from work, Emily would press her hand to the window pane and wonder if anyone out there remembered her name. That summer, Rachel told distant relatives that Emily was living with her biological father in California. She sent out a few brief emails from an old account she barely used. She said Emily was happy and adjusting well to the change, but Emily's father had died in a car accident when she was 2 years old. Judith Carter knew that. So did most of the extended family. But when they tried to reply, the emails bounced back. The account had been deactivated days later. Judith called Rachel's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again. She left messages asking to speak to Emily. There was no response. She drove by the house, but no one answered the door. The mail was collected. The lawn was mowed. But the windows were still shuttered. Judith sat in her car for over an hour, hoping to see a curtain move or a shadow pass. Nothing happened. She drove home with her hands clenched on the steering wheel. She started a journal that night and began writing down everything she could remember about Emily's last visit. It was the only way she knew how to keep her memory alive. By November, Rachel deleted every social media account she had. Her Facebook page vanished overnight. All photos of Emily disappeared. Family members called each other in confusion. Some thought she might be running from something. Others said she had always been private. The only sign of life came at Christmas. A card arrived at Judith's house with no return address. It was printed from a generic holiday website. Inside, in typed text, it read, "We are traveling with limited service. Everything is fine. No need to worry." That was all. No names, no photos. Just a message that felt cold and distant. Judith read it 3 times. Then she placed it in a box, along with the other strange items she had collected over the years. She labeled the box, Emily. It sat on the top shelf of her hall closet where she kept old letters and baby clothes. She refused to throw it away. Something inside her told her this was not over. Rachel's appearance changed over the following months. A neighbor at a nearby grocery store noticed she had dyed her hair darker and wore sunglasses indoors. She paid in cash and avoided conversation. The woman at the register thought she looked familiar, but could not place her name. Rachel's name no longer appeared on any school rosters or community programs. Emily was not listed on any medical record under her birth name. Gary had erased every trace of her existence. At home, Emily was told she could not use the computer or the phone. She could not write letters or make drawings unless they were inspected. If she broke the rules, she was sent to the basement. The door had 3-door locks. There was no light inside. Emily kept track of the time by counting her breaths. She learned how long it took for Gary to return from work and how many hours she might stay in darkness. Her world shrank to the corners of rooms and the weight of silence. One night, Emily heard her mother crying in the bathroom. She pressed her ear to the door and heard Rachel whispering something over and over again. It sounded like "I am sorry." The next morning, Rachel avoided her completely. She placed a tray of toast and milk on the floor and walked away. Emily did not speak. She sat with the food untouched and waited. It was clear something had shifted. Rachel was more distant. Gary more tense. The house smelled of paint and cleaning chemicals. Something was being prepared. That week, Gary burned a pile of clothes in the backyard and told the neighbors they were cleaning out old junk. No one questioned him. He smiled and waved. People nodded back. No one asked where Emily was. By the time Emily turned 13, she no longer answered to her real name. Gary began calling her Ella. Rachel followed. The name appeared on the mail and in the few documents they used. Gary claimed they had moved to start fresh and protect their privacy. He said Ella was being homeschooled, and no one questioned it. In Mountain View, a small town surrounded by hills and quiet roads, the neighbors were friendly, but not intrusive. The house they rented sat at the end of a gravel lane. It had a wraparound porch and a large backyard. Gary built a shed near the trees and kept it locked. Emily was told never to go near it. Rachel rarely left the house. She spent most days cleaning or staring out the window with a blank expression. Gary came and went working private security jobs in nearby counties. He spoke politely to neighbors and introduced Rachel as his quiet wife and Ella as his stepdaughter. No one suspected anything unusual. Ella walked with her head down and her voice barely above a whisper. She obeyed without resistance. Every evening she sat in her room and filled page after page in her sketchbook. In 2015, Gary enrolled Ella in a homeschool enrichment program at a local church. It offered classes in art, music, and literature once a week. The families who attended assumed she was shy. She never spoke during group activities and never made eye contact. She arrived on time and left without saying goodbye. Her paperwork listed Gary as her guardian. The address on file matched the rental home. No one noticed that her birth year had been changed. It said she was 14 when she was already 16. Rachel signed the forms with a steady hand and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The program director welcomed them and praised their interest in creative learning. Ella was placed in a beginner's art class led by a woman named Miss Danvers. She was in her 50s and had a kind, warm presence. She wore paint-streaked aprons and often brought homemade cookies to class. From the first session, she noticed Ella worked quickly and with intense focus. Her drawings had depth and shadows that stood out among the cheerful landscapes of other students. Ella never spoke unless asked. Even then, her answers were short and careful. She never discussed her family or home life, but her drawings began to raise questions. One showed a hallway with doors that had no knobs. Another showed a girl holding a candle in a room made of stone. One page depicted a child curled under a staircase. When Miss Danvers complimented the detail, Ella simply nodded and returned to her work. Over the weeks, the themes grew darker. Miss Danvers kept a file of Ella's sketches. She told herself it might just be artistic expression. But deep down, she knew these images were more than imagination. One drawing in particular gave her pause. It showed a basement stairwell, narrow and steep, leading to a locked door. On the back of the paper in faint pencil were the words, "I used to scream here." Miss Danvers stared at the note for several minutes before placing the page in a folder. Later that month, another sketch caught her attention. It showed a tall man in a uniform standing beside a girl in a torn nightgown. The man had a gold badge and no eyes. In the bottom corner, scribbled in small, uneven print, were the words, "He said no one would believe me." Miss Danvers felt a chill run through her chest. She had worked with children for over 20 years and knew trauma when she saw it. She did not want to frighten Ella. Instead, she invited her to stay after class one day to help organize supplies. When they were alone, she asked if Ella would be interested in meeting a friend who helped students prepare art portfolios. She said he had worked with teens applying for scholarships. Ella nodded cautiously. Miss Danvers scheduled a meeting for the following week. Her friend was not a recruiter. He was a licensed therapist who specialized in trauma and worked with youth through art therapy. They agreed to speak to Ella gently, without pressure. Miss Danvers hoped it might be the beginning of something. Ella arrived for the meeting wearing the same oversized hoodie she always wore. Her sketchbook was tucked under her arm. The therapist introduced himself as someone who helped young artists build confidence. He asked her to show some of her work. Ella flipped slowly through the pages. He asked what the drawings meant to her. She did not answer at first. He asked if she ever used images to remember things. She stared at one drawing of a girl behind a wall. After a long pause, she whispered, "That door is real. I was not supposed to draw it." The therapist kept his voice steady. He asked if she felt safe at home. Ella did not respond, but her hand trembled slightly. He asked if there was someone she trusted. She looked at Miss Danvers and said nothing. The therapist called the State Child Protection Hotline that evening. He filed a report under her legal name, Ella Benson. But before hanging up, he gave them another name. He said she used to be called Emily Carter. The day after the report was filed, Miss Danvers was asked to quietly bring in any materials related to Ella's art. She returned to her classroom late that afternoon and sat at her desk, flipping through the folder she had kept for months. The images still unsettled her. Some showed impossible angles of cramped stairwells, others the same hallway repeated over and over, always ending in a blank wall. The most disturbing sketch was of a girl staring at herself in a cracked mirror, her expression unreadable. The mirror reflected not the girl's face, but a shadow. In the bottom corner were numbers written in faint red crayon. They looked like measurements: height, width, depth. Miss Danvers realized they described something small and enclosed. She reached out to the therapist again and shared the entire folder. He took them seriously. That evening, he contacted the child services investigator assigned to the case and included the drawings in his initial packet. The images were scanned and reviewed by a trauma specialist. What she saw mirrored known signs of long-term confinement and psychological distress. She marked the case as urgent. A team was assembled within the week to locate Ella and verify her living situation. Ella did not return to the next art session. Miss Danvers waited in the supply room with the same tray of cookies and the little plastic cups of juice she always prepared. When no one arrived by the second hour, she knew something had changed. Meanwhile, the child protection team contacted local authorities in Mountain View. A deputy was sent to the listed address with a state agent. They knocked. Rachel answered, her face pale and her voice soft. When asked if Ella was home, she nodded but did not call her. Gary came to the door a moment later, his expression calm. He said there must have been a mistake. He insisted Ella was his legal ward. He showed papers. The agent requested to speak to Ella directly. Gary said she was sleeping. The agent asked to see her. Gary hesitated. Rachel stood frozen behind him. Then Ella appeared behind the doorway, her face expressionless. The agent asked if she was Ella Benson. She nodded slowly. When asked if she felt safe, she looked toward Rachel, then down at her feet. She whispered one word. No. Gary was asked to step aside. He resisted briefly, but complied. Ella was escorted outside while the agent requested backup. Rachel followed, but did not speak. Ella was taken to a local shelter that night. Her drawings were brought with her. A psychologist met with her the next morning. Over several hours, she opened her sketchbook and identified each page. She explained the meaning behind the locked doors. She pointed to a picture of a mattress on the floor of a concrete space. She said the room had no window, only a pipe in the ceiling. She described the sound of footsteps upstairs and the feeling of time passing slowly in the dark. When asked where the room was, she said it was in Ohio. She did not know the exact address, but remembered the smell of the carpet and the sound of a church bell in the distance. The psychologist marked each image with notes. Ella spoke slowly, carefully, but her memories were sharp. The pictures told a consistent story. One of captivity, one of fear, and most of all, one of a girl who had been waiting to be heard. The state investigators contacted records departments in Ohio and began tracing the identity of Emily Carter. The story unraveled quickly. Rachel Carter had once lived in a small Ohio town with her daughter and her second husband, Gary Benson. School records confirmed Emily had been enrolled until 2009. A note in the file indicated concern for possible abuse. A withdrawn report had been filed years prior. CPS records had closed the case due to lack of follow-up. No documentation confirmed where Emily had gone. Her name had vanished from state registries. The address they once lived at had since been sold. The current owners had no knowledge of prior tenants. Investigators drove to the property and conducted a walkthrough. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. Then one officer noticed a panel in the basement wall that sounded hollow. They removed insulation and drywall. Behind it was a sealed space about 6 feet by 8 feet. The walls were scratched with markings, stick figures, words like stop and cold. It had been repainted, but under the new layer the original drawings matched the ones in Ella's book. The investigators stood in silence. They had found the room. A locked metal box was discovered under a floorboard in a far corner of the basement. Inside were several items: a child's hospital bracelet with the name Emily, a photo of a girl holding a stuffed animal, a birth certificate with the original name. At the bottom of the box was a small thumb drive. When examined, it revealed 4 short video files. In each, Rachel appeared whispering into the camera. She was thinner, her eyes swollen. In the first video, she explained that she had tried to leave, but Gary had threatened to kill them both. In the second, she apologized to her mother and begged anyone watching to protect Emily. The third video described how she planned to run away and leave evidence behind. The fourth was short. Rachel said she was going to try again. She said if no one ever found them, they should look behind the barn. The screen went dark. Authorities resumed the search. The art co-op classroom felt strangely quiet without Ella. Miss Danvers stood at the supply cabinet, her hands resting on a stack of unused sketch pads. She had spent the past week reviewing every memory of her time with the girl who had once sat quietly in the corner seat. She remembered how Ella always packed up her supplies 10 minutes early and kept her chair slightly angled away from the others. Her silence had once seemed like shyness. Now it echoed with meaning. The therapist who had helped Ella during the first conversation returned to the co-op that morning. He wanted to talk to Miss Danvers again. They sat at a folding table near the windows, surrounded by faded posters and dried-out markers. He asked more questions this time. He wanted to know if Ella had ever mentioned names or places. Miss Danvers shook her head. Then she opened her phone and showed him a picture. It was one she had taken during a class art show. Ella stood in the background near a display board. On the board behind her was a sketch pinned without label. It was the stairwell drawing. The therapist zoomed in and pointed to the bottom step. There was a number faintly written beside it. That number was part of an address. Investigators in Ohio had missed it during the first inspection. When they returned to the property, they checked behind the barn, as Rachel had said in the final video. They found disturbed earth near the tree line, a place overgrown with weeds and brush. The forensic team began digging slowly, carefully. 3 feet down, they uncovered a section of blue fabric. It was part of a dress. The floral print matched the one Rachel had worn in her last known social media photo from 2013. The medical examiner confirmed the remains were hers. She had been buried without markers, wrapped in a thin plastic sheet. In her pocket was a folded piece of paper. The ink had blurred, but the words were still visible. It read, "Tell her I tried." The discovery confirmed what Emily had shared during interviews. Her mother had been trying to get them out. She had recorded evidence. She had hidden proof. But in the end, she had paid the price for her defiance. The agents who worked the case stood quietly as Rachel was lifted from the earth. A mother who had never been reported missing. A woman who had vanished without a trace. Back at the shelter, Emily was told about the discovery. She sat still for a long time and said nothing. Then she asked to be alone. She returned to her room and pulled out her sketchbook. That night she drew a picture of a girl kneeling by a tree. Above the tree was a sky filled with soft clouds and a single red bird flying away. The girl was holding a flower. It was simple, quiet, and full of silence that words could not hold. She gave the drawing to her therapist the next day. It was not labeled. She did not explain it, but he understood. That same day, he contacted the district attorney's office. He shared the newest sketch and added it to the growing collection of evidence. A team was now working full-time on preparing charges. Gary Benson had been placed under surveillance. He still worked private security at local events. He moved through the world as if nothing had changed. He smiled at neighbors. He nodded at shopkeepers. But his name was now marked in red ink on official documents. The therapist returned to the co-op and met with a small group of staff. He presented a workshop under the title Recognizing Silent Expression in Youth. He used examples from various cases, but included several of Ella's images with her permission. He spoke softly and carefully, explaining how trauma can hide in plain sight. Miss Danvers watched as her colleagues took notes and nodded. She wondered how many other children had passed through those rooms carrying stories no one ever heard. She kept the final image of the stairwell pinned above her desk. It was no longer just a sketch. It was a map that had led people back to the truth. At the end of the session, one young instructor raised her hand and asked what had made Ella trust Miss Danvers. The therapist paused before answering. He said sometimes it is not about trust. Sometimes it is just about not giving up when a child says nothing. Sometimes listening means believing what is not said. Later that week, Emily met with a new guardian. The state had begun the process of transferring her into long-term care with her grandmother, Judith. The reunification had been carefully planned. A team of therapists and social workers would assist. Judith had been contacted after the body was found and had driven down immediately. She stayed in a nearby hotel waiting for the day she could see her granddaughter again. When they finally sat together in the same room, there were no dramatic gestures or emotional outbursts. Judith simply reached across the table and placed her hand over Emily's. They sat that way for several minutes, saying nothing. The therapist in the corner wiped at his eyes. A caseworker filled out forms silently. The room held the quiet weight of something being rebuilt. Emily looked at her grandmother and whispered, "I am still here." Judith nodded once. That was all either of them needed to say. 2 weeks after the confirmation of Rachel's remains, investigators returned to the old neighborhood where the Carters once lived. A small task force assembled near the edge of the property, marking off the barn and the surrounding field. The wind carried the scent of spring soil and broken leaves. Officers walked the perimeter, slowly scanning for any additional evidence that might have been missed. The media had not yet learned of the body's discovery. Authorities wanted time to gather every remaining piece before the case became public. Inside the basement, forensic teams worked under harsh lighting. They examined the concrete for blood traces, old fibers, or tools. Behind the wall panel, they found fragments of tape, a cracked plastic hairbrush, and a piece of cloth with faded cartoon prints. Emily's old blanket. These were not just items. They were markers of time. Objects that confirmed she had spent years in that room. The walls still held the faint indentations from the drawings she had etched with crayons or fingernails. The air was thick with mildew and insulation dust. No one spoke as they worked. They did not need to. Every corner told part of the truth. Back in the town records office, clerks searched old files tied to Gary Benson. He had served briefly with the sheriff's department in the late 90s. He left without public explanation. Personnel notes showed a few complaints from fellow officers, most relating to inappropriate behavior and misuse of authority. Nothing had ever been formally pursued. His exit was marked as voluntary. That position had given him access to information and relationships he later used to manipulate people around him. Former neighbors described him as polite but controlling. They remembered seeing Rachel less often after their marriage. They recalled how Emily stopped playing outside. One woman remembered seeing Emily at a yard sale clinging to her mother's side and flinching at loud noises. The memory now seemed sharper. She told investigators she had always felt something was off, but never had proof. One of Gary's co-workers from a security job said he spoke of his stepdaughter in strange terms, always past tense, always vague. A pattern was forming. Everyone had seen something, but no one had seen enough. At the State Crime Lab, analysts reviewed the thumb drive found in the basement. The 4 videos were carefully preserved and digitized. Each one was reviewed frame by frame. Rachel's voice trembled throughout the recordings. She looked into the lens with desperation. Her surroundings shifted slightly between videos. In the second video, a newspaper was visible on the table behind her. Investigators matched the date to a local headline about a school fundraiser in 2013. The evidence timeline was taking shape. In the final video, the audio quality dipped. But Rachel's final words were clear. She said if anyone was watching, they needed to believe Emily. She said she was sorry for not leaving sooner. Then she looked directly into the camera and said, "Please tell her I loved her." That moment became central to the prosecution's argument. It was not just evidence. It was a mother's final plea. Investigators paused the footage at that exact frame. They printed a still and placed it inside the case folder. It would later become part of the trial exhibit. News finally broke that month. A press conference was held outside the county courthouse. Reporters gathered under gray skies as the district attorney stepped to the podium. She confirmed the recovery of Rachel Carter's remains and announced charges against Gary Benson for kidnapping, abuse, and second-degree murder. Reporters asked questions that could not be answered publicly. The DA requested privacy for the victim, now 17, who had lived under a false identity for nearly half her life. The town reacted with disbelief. Social media pages filled with shock and apologies. Some former neighbors posted old photos of Emily smiling in school plays and birthday parties. They wrote messages of regret. They admitted they had not asked enough questions. Judith Carter did not attend the press event. She stayed home with Emily, watching from the living room in silence. When the broadcast ended, she reached for her granddaughter's hand. Emily did not speak, but she looked at the television one last time, then closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Investigators continued compiling the timeline. They documented how Gary had used forged documents to move states. They found a pattern of isolation and control. No employment history under Rachel's name after 2012. No medical visits for Emily. No school enrollment records. They created a map that tracked her disappearance from Ohio to Arkansas. At each point along the line, there were chances to intervene. Each chance had passed without action. The lead investigator wrote in his final report that the case revealed systemic failure at every level. The agencies that should have helped had dismissed warning signs. The school had flagged concerns, but the process had no follow-through. CPS had closed the case too soon. Law enforcement had trusted internal reputation over evidence. Emily's file was marked closed because of silence. That silence was now evidence. The report was submitted to the governor's office with a request to reopen similar past cases. It was no longer just about justice. It was about prevention. One voice had shaken the system. One voice buried in drawings had forced people to listen. The search behind the barn had ended with the discovery of Rachel's body, but investigators continued surveying the property. The goal was to build a full account of Rachel's final days. Soil samples near the grave revealed multiple attempts to dig and refill earth, suggesting more than one effort to bury evidence. Investigators uncovered a shallow trench nearby, with fragments of burnt paper and melted plastic. Forensic analysts later confirmed the remains were part of a destroyed phone and shredded documents. From what could be recovered, investigators found traces of a bus schedule printed for a route leading out of state. That single detail reshaped the narrative. Rachel had not just recorded videos and hidden drawings. She had been planning to escape. Witness interviews confirmed that the family had been seen shopping for camping gear weeks before her disappearance. One local store owner remembered Rachel paying in cash for a small tent and backpack. She never used the store loyalty card that day. She had been trying to leave without leaving a trail. Investigators returned to the basement and reevaluated every mark and object. A crayon used to draw on the walls had Rachel's fingerprints. She had not just tolerated the silence. She had been leaving signs. A search of nearby woods based on tree patterns in Emily's drawings led authorities to a narrow deer path that ran between two fenced properties. At a bend in the trail, investigators found remnants of cloth and a rusted flashlight. Further along was a shallow indentation in the ground with half-buried food wrappers. These items matched products sold during the week Rachel disappeared. They had likely tried to camp there. Evidence suggested they spent at least one night in the woods before returning. One officer found initials carved into a low-hanging tree limb. The carving read EC plus RC. The marks were faint, but real. Experts later confirmed the carving had been made within the last decade. It became clear that Rachel and Emily had once escaped, even if only briefly. But something forced them back. Whether it was fear, threat, or exhaustion remained uncertain. What was certain was that Rachel had risked everything. She had not been complicit. She had been fighting from within. Her silence was survival. Her final actions were resistance. When questioned again, Emily confirmed that her mother once packed a small bag and told her to stay quiet no matter what. They had left late at night while Gary was away for a weekend job. They had walked through woods and followed train tracks. Emily remembered the cold. She remembered her mother's hand shaking. They slept under trees. But Rachel kept looking back toward the house. After 2 days, she told Emily they needed one more day to prepare. They returned. That night, Emily was locked in the basement again. She never saw her mother awake after that. The memory was not clear, but she recalled footsteps above, and then silence. Then Gary appeared saying her mother had gone to visit family. That moment had fractured something inside her. For years, she had blamed herself for not running faster or speaking louder. She had drawn Rachel's eyes over and over. Now she knew the truth. Her mother had chosen to protect her even at the cost of her own life. Forensic pathologists confirmed Rachel's cause of death as blunt force trauma. No defensive wounds were found. The positioning of the body and the layering of the grave suggested she had been killed quickly. Prosecutors used this detail to argue that Rachel's murder was intended to ensure long-term control over Emily. At trial, they presented the video diaries and highlighted Rachel's final request to protect her daughter. The prosecution's narrative focused not just on physical abuse but on psychological imprisonment. Rachel's voice became central to the courtroom. The recordings were played without interruption. Jurors watched as Rachel whispered her truths into the camera. They listened as she begged for someone to believe what had happened behind the locked doors of her home. Emily chose not to attend that part of the trial, but she approved the use of the footage. She wanted her mother's words to be heard without filter. The court grew silent during each recording. People wept quietly. No one interrupted. Even the judge appeared visibly moved. Emily and Judith visited the wooded site privately, under police escort. The grave had been covered again after the investigation, but a small white marker now stood beside it. Judith placed a flower on the spot, and whispered something Emily could not hear. Emily stood quietly and held her sketchbook. She had drawn the trees as she remembered them. On the last page, she drew her mother holding her hand and looking forward. The faces were gentle. The lines were soft. She left the drawing under a rock at the base of the tree where the initials were carved. She did not want to take it back. She wanted it to stay there. She wanted the forest to remember that they had been there, that her mother had not given up, that someone had tried to save her, and that in the end she was not alone. The courtroom felt too large that day. The ceiling stretched high above the wooden benches, and the air buzzed with a quiet tension that made each breath feel heavier. Reporters had gathered outside the courthouse, but were not allowed beyond the marble entryway. Inside the room, Emily sat at a table with her grandmother beside her. The prosecutor spoke in a calm tone, reading from documents that summarized a decade of silence, pain, and buried truths. Gary Benson sat across the room in a plain gray suit, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face unreadable. He had been arrested at a county fair where he had been working a security shift. When the officers approached, he smiled as if nothing in the world had changed. Now he sat between two federal marshals no longer able to control the narrative. Emily did not look at him as the charges were read aloud. The court listed each count with precision: kidnapping, child endangerment, second-degree murder, forgery, unlawful imprisonment. The list filled several pages. But to Emily, none of the words captured the full weight of what had been taken. When asked if she wanted to make a statement, Emily stood and approached the witness stand slowly. The courtroom grew silent. Her voice was soft but steady. She spoke not to Gary, but to the people who had never stopped searching. She thanked her grandmother for never forgetting. She thanked her art teacher for noticing the drawings. She thanked the therapist who sat through the silence and never pressured her to speak. Then she paused. She opened a folder and removed a single sketch. She handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The sketch showed a girl sitting beside a window with morning light spilling across her lap. Outside the window was a garden in bloom. The girl held a pencil, but had not yet begun to draw. The judge studied the image for a long moment before setting it down with care. Emily returned to her seat without looking at Gary. She had said what she came to say. Words were never her only language. She let the drawing speak the rest. Gary showed no reaction when the sentence was read: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained quiet. There were no cheers or angry outbursts, only a long exhale from those who had waited years for this moment. As the room began to empty, Emily remained seated. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the quiet wash over her. This was not the end of her story, but it was the end of his control over it. The judge left the bench. The attorneys gathered their files. Judith placed a hand on Emily's shoulder and whispered that it was time to go. Outside the courthouse, the reporters waited, but Emily walked past them without a word. She did not owe anyone her pain. She owed herself peace. Later that month, Emily and Judith moved to Minnesota. They chose a small town near the edge of a lake where the winters were long and the trees turned gold in October. Emily enrolled in community college and began studying psychology and art therapy. She spent her weekends volunteering at a local youth center where she led quiet drawing sessions for children who needed space more than questions. She never told them her story unless they asked. Most of the time, they did not need to. They understood her through the way she listened, through the way she showed them how to blend colors without fear, through the way she created safety in silence. The staff at the center admired her calmness and said she had a gift. She never argued. She only nodded and returned to her sketchbook. In her second year of school, Emily was invited to participate in a local gallery show titled Stories Without Words. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. She selected 8 pieces from her past and created 4 new ones. The final image in her collection was titled Things We Drew in the Dark. It showed 2 hands reaching for each other across a field of shadow. One hand was smaller. The other bore a wedding ring. In the corner of the canvas was a small red bird perched on a branch. The gallery opened on a rainy Thursday night. Visitors moved slowly through the space, pausing to study each piece. Some recognized the media coverage from years ago. Others saw only the art and nothing more. Toward the end of the evening, a young girl around 7 approached Emily and pointed to the final painting. She said she had once drawn something similar, but no one believed her. Emily knelt beside her and asked if she wanted to draw together sometime. The girl nodded. Emily handed her a card and told her she would always have a seat waiting. That night, Emily walked home with her grandmother under a sky that had begun to clear. The rain left the pavement shining, and the air smelled of pine and earth. Judith said she was proud of her. Emily smiled and said she was learning to be proud of herself too. At home, she placed her unused sketchbooks on a shelf and opened a new one. The first page she filled with color. Bright reds, warm yellows, blues that reminded her of summer afternoons. She wrote no words. She did not need to. Her life was no longer a secret buried behind drywall. It was a story she had chosen to tell on her own terms. Emily's story became part of a new training program for teachers and counselors. Her artwork was included in a digital archive used to teach professionals how to recognize hidden trauma. She never sought the spotlight. She only wanted children like her to know they were not alone. She believed in the power of quiet bravery. She believed healing did not always come with loud declarations. Sometimes it came with a pencil and a blank page. If this story moved, you make sure to like and subscribe for more true-style mystery narratives that stay with you long after the video ends. Let us know in the comments what part of the plot stayed with you most and where you are watching from. We read every message and your thoughts help shape the next story.